Hindsight is always 20/20 in the sports world, so even though we may look back on certain events and think they were insane for happening, at the time, they were probably looking more reasonable and balanced. Regardless though, mistakes are mistakes, regardless of what the reaction was at the time, and this brings us to the topic of today's video, and the series of videos coming up here on the channel. I actually did this 2 years ago, where I went through a bunch of the recent NBA drafts, and using hindsight, graded the lottery picks from each draft years after the fact, and now that a few more years have passed, it feels like a good time to revisit this topic and do it again, now that we have even more information at our disposal. Specifically, today we'll be taking a look at the 2020 NBA Draft Lottery, grading each pick made 2 years later. Before we start though, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, as all support is very much appreciated. Now with that being said, let's begin. Starting things off here, the Minnesota Timberwolves selected Anthony Edwards first overall, and the grade 2 years later is a strong A. Edwards was seen as the top prospect by many at the time of the draft, but it wasn't necessarily unanimous, but now 2 years later, it's very much looking like they got it right, and that he will be the best player from this year's draft. Last season, he elevated his play, scoring over 21 points per game, he became much more efficient after his rookie season, and his explosive athleticism is so tough for any defender to contain. He does admittedly play a bit out of control at times, and does definitely need to improve his shot selection on a consistent basis, but for a 21-year-old guard who produces at the level he does, that's just nitpicking. He's one of the most talented young players in the game, and the Wolves have no regrets picking him first. Next up, the Golden State Warriors selected James Wiseman second overall, and unfortunately the grade here after 2 years is an F. This isn't me saying that Wiseman is a complete draft bust, because he very likely will end up being a productive center eventually, but within the context of how he was selected second overall in an incredibly talented draft, and he's both struggled with injuries and demonstrated a lot of bad habits early on in the time that he was on the court, it makes this an objectively bad pick. At the time LaMelo Ball was viewed as the second best player in the draft, the Warriors passed on the opportunity to draft him, and now LaMelo Ball is an all-star. Wiseman is getting back onto the court this year after being injured all of last year, so we all hope he can start to show some flashes this season, but unfortunately the grade here is more based on where he was drafted than what he actually is as a prospect because of the context. Next, with the third pick, the Charlotte Hornets selected LaMelo Ball, and the grade here is another strong A. The Hornets needed a prospect to build around at the time, and they got it when they selected LaMelo here. In his first 2 seasons, he's been one of the most fun and exciting players to watch, he's already emerged as one of the best passing talents in the NBA, and despite concerns about his ability to score at the time of the draft, he's coming off of a season where he just averaged an efficient 20 points per game. He's so crafty with the ball in his hands, he makes threes at a 39% clip, his court vision is top-notch, and he stuffs the stat sheet on a nightly basis. This past season he made his first All-Star game, which should be the first of many to come. Up next with the fourth pick, the Chicago Bulls selected Patrick Williams, and the grade here 2 years later is a C+. Patrick Williams being taken 4th overall was pretty surprising on draft night when it happened, but in the 2 years since, this pick definitely hasn't been that bad. Williams has shown some potential on the defensive end of the floor, but offensively that raw talent that he was at the time is still what he is now, and he's a ways away from it being fully unlocked. He missed most of last season due to injury, but when he was on the court, albeit in a small sample size, he did reliably knock down perimeter jumpers, just on only a few attempts per game, but he's not really much of a threat to create elsewhere for himself off the dribble at this point in time, and his production of 9 points and 4 rebounds per game don't exactly jump out at you. Ideally, he becomes a solid 3-and-D guy, but when you're drafting 4th overall, you typically hope for someone with a higher ceiling than that. Up next with the 5th pick, the Cleveland Cavaliers selected Isaac Okoro, and the grade for this pick is a B-. Similar to the last selection, Okoro's ceiling is already looking fairly low, where he is a talented defensive player who competes hard on that end, but is a pretty limited offensive threat. He's a decent shooter at best who is mostly used as a spot-up guy and not much else. He can slash to the basket and finish there, but in low volume, and he's a guy who will give you good minutes in the rotation in his role, but again, when you're picking in the top 5, you should probably be shooting a bit higher, hoping to land someone with star talent, especially in a draft like this that was loaded with talent. The pick wasn't bad, but it just wasn't that impressive either. Next up, with the 6th pick, the Atlanta Hawks selected Onyeka Okongwu, and the grade here is a nice B+. 2 years ago, I was someone who was under the impression that Okongwu was the best big man in the draft class, and 2 years later, while it has been a slow process, he has begun to take some big steps forward, especially at the end of last season. Okongwu is currently backing up Clint Capella in Atlanta, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if he overtook that starting center job sooner rather than later, because his extremely versatile defensive skill set is crucial to a Hawks team that otherwise struggles on that end of the floor. He can defend perimeter players as well as protect the rim, then offensively, he finishes incredibly well around the basket, having made 69% of his shots last year. Up next, with the 7th pick, the Detroit Pistons selected Killian Hayes, and the grade here 2 years later is unfortunately another F. Any of you who have watched my prior grading videos should know that I'm not necessarily quick to hand out Fs as grades, but it's really hard not to give one here when Hayes is one of the biggest modern examples of being a draft bust. At the time of the draft 2 years ago, I really wanted him to be good, but 2 years later he has barely shown anything worthwhile on the court, and the Pistons are already seemingly beginning to plan their futures without him. He's one of the least efficient scorers in the NBA, he's been a poor defender, and while his court vision and passing ability isn't that bad, it's not enough to overcome his struggles elsewhere. Next up, with the 8th pick, the New York Knicks selected Obi Toppin, and the grade here is a C+. When the Knicks took Toppin here, he wasn't necessarily a player that played a position of need for them, but they believed that he was the best player available. Their intentions were right because you should always be drafting the best player available, but the execution was wrong, as now 2 years later, Obi is a decent player at best compared to some of the talent that was available at the time, including Tyrese Haliburton, who most expected to be a top 10 draft pick back then in 2020, who slipped to the end of the lottery and is now looking like a star in the making. Toppin is a decent backup power forward who uses his athleticism to operate well as a slasher attacking the rim, but he will need to improve his three-point shot to earn a bigger role moving forward. Up next, with the 9th pick, the Washington Wizards selected Deni Avdija, and the grade here is a B-. Deni is a player that has established himself as a jack-of-all-trades sort of talent, where he's very skilled and decent at most aspects of the game, but he really isn't good or great at any specific thing. He'll give you productive minutes, but is probably destined to be a role player throughout his career, so as someone taken in the middle of the lottery, it was a decent pick, but not a great one. Next up, with the 10th pick, the Phoenix Suns selected Jalen Smith, and unfortunately we're getting our 3rd F grade of the video. The Suns were different than most typical lottery teams back then in that they immediately became contenders in Smith's first season with them, but it never even felt like the Suns made an effort to give him a chance. On top of this, Smith was viewed as a reach of a pick at the time of the draft too, so them taking him 10th overall just looks even worse in hindsight. The Suns ended up trading Jalen Smith to the Indiana Pacers last season, where he did actually start to show some flashes, but the Suns traded him for Torrey Craig, so essentially the Suns traded a top 10 draft pick for a career role player who scores 6 points per game in his career. That's about as worst case scenario as it can get. Next, with the 11th pick, the San Antonio Spurs selected Devin Vassell, and the grade here is a B. Vassell doesn't have a flashy game, but he's another player in the 3-and-D mold who has actually shown the most potential of the guys I've mentioned today in that category, yet he was taken near the end of the lottery, making it better value for the Spurs. He's a solid perimeter defender who scored 12 points per game last season. As we get deeper into the lottery too, this is the kind of talent you hope to land, and the Spurs did exactly that. Next, with the 12th pick, the Sacramento Kings selected Tyrese Haliburton, and the grade here is an A+. Haliburton slipping outside of the top 10 was a head-scratcher 2 years ago, and now 2 years later, it continues to be the case. In Sacramento, Haliburton emerged as one of the best young point guards in the league, and even though he's no longer on the team, as they traded him away, the Kings did get Domantas Sabonis in return for him, who is a bona fide all-star talent, so it's not like they let him go for a cheap price. Absolutely zero complaints about this pick, as it was tremendous for late lottery value. Next up, with the 13th pick, the New Orleans Pelicans selected Kira Lewis, and the grade here is a C. Lewis hasn't really made much of an impact at the NBA level yet, but in the limited minutes he's gotten, he has shown blistering speed that could be tapped into as his career progresses. He's a young guard that needed time to develop, and is still in that developmental phase, so this can be viewed as a mediocre pick at best. And finally, the last pick of the lottery was Aaron Nesmith, made by the Boston Celtics, and the grade here is a D. The entire appeal with Nesmith as a prospect, to even make him a consideration as a lottery talent at the time, was that he was supposed to be a knockdown shooter, but through 2 seasons, he has shot the ball pretty poorly, and as a result, was unable to even crack the Celtics rotation on a consistent basis. He got traded to the Indiana Pacers this offseason, so hopefully in a team with less immediate pressure, he can develop, but for now, it's more of a bad pick in hindsight. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below how you would grade these selections from 2 years ago's draft. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.